policymakers, when faced with lack of growth, they change the definition of growth. For example, they'll change how to calculate GDP. They'll change how to calculate CPI. Now we have a new central banker coming in to England. His name is Mark Carney. They're bringing him over from Canada. He's talking about nominal GDP growth. Isn't that just basically more of this shuffling around definitions to hide the fact that the economies are in free fall? Your thoughts?
Absolutely. I think we're going to change that. I mean, the French are experimenting with gross national happiness. So if you live in France and, if you could include things like the amount of garlic in your food and the beauty of women and the sort of length of skirts, their GDP would be just monstrous. So people will change all the definitions around. You're absolutely correct. The most funny one of that was Argentina. In Argentina, when inflation went through the roof, they decided basically to exclude anything which was going up too fast on the basis that nobody could afford it anyway. So I think we'll see a lot of that. You're absolutely correct. And I think that's going to be a theme of more lies, more hypocrisy, more manipulation on the part of politicians, because we all know without delivering prosperity, they'll have trouble getting re-elected. It's just simple as that.
All right, Das, you're a smart fella. I've got my own theory that I would like to present to you to get your thoughts on it. I call it the zombie economics, and it works like this. There are those in the economy who have access to money at 0%. So every time prices go up, they simply dig deeper into their 0% infinite credit line, so they never feel it. Those who have to pay 3% or 6% or 16% or 30% or a payday loan at 400%, they actually feel it when prices go up. Therefore, the central banks are talking about deflation, but they're talking to people whose cost of money is zero and who have an infinite credit line. They live in a parallel world, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, the classic one is in Japan. If you actually look at Japan, the phrase zombie economics actually comes from Japan, because after the Bank of Japan started to flood the system with money, print money, had zero interest rates, what we saw was exactly what you're describing, except that the fact financial assets didn't go up in price in Japan. But in terms of the real economy, what we saw was that businesses, because they could keep their loans in place, didn't sell damnly bad assets. They didn't do anything. They didn't do any of the steps necessary. And effectively what the zero interest rates do is it's a massive transfer of wealth. So if you've saved money, if you've been a good boy or a good girl and done all the things that you were taught to do, thrift and all of that sort of stuff, you basically now pay the costs of all the people who've borrowed, who more importantly, as you correctly say, will keep borrowing. I mean, Bernanke last year, people missed this at one of his press conferences, admitted that quantitative easing has very little impact on the real economy. What he's trying to do is boost financial asset prices. And read from that, he's trying to help out the financial sector. I mean, basically, the world is one gigantic carry trade with zero interest costs. And that's what we're seeing. And the poor guys who've saved are going to get killed. But, at the end of it, we have to remember a simple truth. People have made bad loans, and the bad loans are resolved in one of two ways. You either write them down, or you pretend not to write them down and stretch them out. We're just stretching it out, and the people paying it are the savers. And that's the tragedy. And I wonder how long the rentier, the middle class, whose savings are being wiped out, will start to protest, not to mention the other group, which is the people who don't have jobs, the 25% or 27% in Spain, the 20% in Greece, the 15% in places like Portugal and Ireland. When are they going to take to the streets and basically tear some buildings down? I think that's the key issues going forward.
Right, so the central banks are stoking social unrest because their definition of their mandate as central bankers is to act like a hedge fund and to stoke asset prices, even though it's destroying the real economy. So they are creating the social unrest that you are suggesting is only going to get worse. Now, one place in the economy where we see a massive distortion is in the sovereign bond prices. The UK gilt, or the sovereign bond market in the UK, is trading at a 300-year high. Treasury bonds in America are trading at a 240-year high. When is the bond bubble going to burst? You've got Bill Gross over at PIMCO suggesting it's going to burst soon. That's why he's moving into some other assets. What do you think about this bond bubble bursting? Is it going to burst in the near term, or can they keep the Ponzi scheme going much longer, Das?
Well, I think they hope they can keep the Ponzi scheme going, and I think it has a bit more to go. But you're absolutely correct. To my mind, sovereign debt and money are synonymous. And I think James Grant caught the moment really well when he said that government bonds basically once gave you risk-free return. Now they give you return-free risk. And they're just debasing that. But the most important thing to understand is why those yields are where they are. People seem to have missed the fundamental fact, which is the Fed was buying 60 to 70%, and at times as high as 90% of all new US Treasury bond issuance. So basically it was like financial masturbation between the US Treasury on the one side and the Fed, who were basically circling the money around from each other. But I'll give you some idea of how absurd the game has got. You were talking about the Bank of England and Mark Carney. But the Bank of England has now made, quote unquote, a profit on its quantitative easing, simply because it's creating reserves, which doesn't cost it anything, and it's buying gilts on the other side, and the positive carry gave them income. They're going to distribute that up to the government as a dividend, and basically the government is going to finance a corporate tax cut from this. I had to read the actual announcement about 6 or 7 times trying to work out how do I get in on this. But to give you some idea of that this is not uniquely an English experiment in the States, what they're talking about is the fact that the Fed issues the bonds, the Treasury buys, I beg your pardon, the Treasury issues them, the Fed buys them. And they're both arms of the same government. So basically what they're talking about is why don't we just forgive the debt? And I said, well, what happens to the balance sheet of the central bank, which holds all this stuff? They said that's just an accounting technicality. This is just debasement of fundamental principles of sound money on a level that we haven't seen. But I think the game has got a little bit to go, simply because everybody wants to believe. Nobody wants to look at the other conclusion, which would be devastating and damaging to everybody. And nobody wants to go down that path. And certainly the politicians aren't going to lead us into that particular decision-making point.
All right, Das, you talk about financial masturbation, and following up on what's happening in the U.S., they're talking about this $1 trillion platinum coin, a magic coin to save America from going over the debt ceiling cliff. And this is, of course, favored by the modern monetary theorists, who also would fall into the camp of the financial masturbators, I have a feeling. What are your thoughts, Das, on the magic $1 trillion platinum coin MMT fandango?
Oh, well, this is brilliant. I actually, MMT, which as you know stands for modern monetary theory, I actually call it magic money tricks. Because basically all they're saying is they can print money. We all know you can print money, but at the ultimate point, money has to represent something real goods and services. And what they forget is if you keep printing money, which is the Gideon Gono, which, as you remember, was the head of the central bank of Zimbabwe, effectively people just stop using the currency. They move to other things, whether it's to precious metals or to an alternative currency. And basically, this game with the platinum coin is just meaningless. At the end of the day, you've got to admit that money is just a means to an end. It's a claim on real goods and services. You've got to be able to eat. You've got to be able to buy things. And debasing currency, debasing trust, does not in any shape or form get you further down the path to financial soundness. But human beings are capable of infinite delusion. You and I both know that. And we'll delude ourselves for just a little bit longer.